My brothers thought they'd won. By manipulating our dying father, they stripped me of my inheritance, leaving me with absolutely nothing. They celebrated, secure in their perfect lives built on a foundation of lies. But they never imagined that in my desperation, I would uncover the one criminal secret holding their entire empire together. They left me with nothing. So I decided I would take everything and burn their world to the ground. Our family wasn't just wealthy, we were a dynasty. Or at least, that's how my father, Harrison Sterling, saw it. He was a man carved from granite and ambition, and his creation, Sterling Homes, was a testament to his sheer force of will. We lived on a sprawling estate that felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to our own success. The gardens were perfect. The marble floors were always polished to a mirror shine, and the silence in the long hallways was just heavy with unspoken expectations. I was the youngest of 3 and the only daughter. My brothers, Richard and Edward, were 10 and 8 years older than me, and they were cast in our father's mold: sharp suits, sharper smiles, and eyes that were always calculating. From the moment they could walk, they were groomed to be the heirs. Richard was the ruthless CEO-in-waiting, a shark with a mind for numbers. Edward was the charmer, the public face, the kind of guy who could sell sand in a desert with a handshake and a blindingly white smile. They were a team, a two-headed dragon guarding the family treasure. And then there was me, Clara, the afterthought, the artistic one. That's what they called me, a label that was both an indulgence and a complete dismissal. While they were learning about hostile takeovers, I was learning to paint. While they summered in the Hamptons making connections, I was in a dusty corner of the library, lost in novels. My father funded my art education with a kind of detached amusement. It was a suitable hobby for a daughter who would one day marry well and produce the next generation of Sterlings. He never took it seriously. And because he didn't, my brothers sure as hell didn't. To them, I was just a decoration, something to be managed but never consulted. But for all the emotional distance, my father and I had a secret world of our own. It was a tiny rebellion against the cold, corporate reality of our lives. On rainy Sunday afternoons, we'd hide away in his private study, a room that smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco. It was the only place in the house that actually felt warm. He wouldn't talk business there. Instead, he'd show me his collection of antique clocks. He'd let me hold the tiny, intricate tools, his large hands guiding mine as we cleaned a gear or polished a brass casing. "Everything has a secret mechanism, Clara," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to be patient enough to find it." It was in those quiet moments that I felt seen, like I was more than just the family's resident dreamer. This bond, as thin as it was a threat to my brothers. They couldn't understand it, so they resented it. I remember one Christmas, I spent weeks restoring a beautiful, dilapidated 19th century mantel clock for him. When I gave it to him, his eyes lit up with this genuine joy that was so rare, it was startling. Later that night, I overheard Richard talking to Edward. "She's trying to manipulate him with that sentimental junk," Richard sneered. "Don't worry," Edward replied, his voice smooth as silk. "He knows who the real heirs are." They were always closing ranks, always making sure I was on the outside looking in. They saw an emotional connection and twisted it into a play for power. They could never get it through their heads that all I wanted was a father, not a chairman of the board. Then the illness came. It started slow, a creeping fog that stole the sharp edges of my father's mind, a cruel form of dementia that took him piece by piece. The powerful patriarch started to seem like a confused old man. This was the moment Richard and Edward had been waiting for. Their control over him became absolute. They managed his schedule, his medication, and most importantly, who he saw. My visits were cut back. "He's tired, Clara. He's having a bad day. We don't want to confuse him." They were isolating him. I'd see him on my approved visits, and he'd look at me with a flicker of recognition, a deep sadness in his eyes, but he was too lost in the fog to fight. The last time I saw him alive, he gripped my hand so hard his knuckles turned white. He tried to speak, but the words were a jumble. Only 2 came out clearly, a desperate whisper. "Forgive me." I didn't understand. Forgive him for what? For being sick. As I left the room, the image of my brothers standing in the doorway, their faces like stone, was burned into my memory. They weren't caregivers. They were vultures, waiting for him to die. The day my father died was a study in contrasts. The sky outside was a brilliant, almost offensive blue, while the inside of the mansion was shrouded in a heavy, fake grief. My brothers walked around with somber faces, accepting condolences from people who were there to take the temperature of the new regime, not to mourn a man. I just felt this hollow ache. I hadn't just lost my father, I'd been losing him for years, piece by piece. The reading of the will was a week later. Just me, Richard, Edward, and the family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. Abernathy had been my father's confidant for decades. He'd given me piggyback rides at summer picnics. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. We gathered in the study, the very room where my father and I had shared our world of clocks. The irony hit me like a punch to the gut. Richard and Edward sat together on the sofa, a united front of dark suits and quiet confidence. I sat opposite them, feeling small. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and began to read in a dry monotone. He droned on through the legal jargon. Then his words sliced through the haze. To my sons, Richard Sterling and Edward Sterling, I bequeath my entire controlling interest in Sterling Homes to be shared jointly and equally. He kept going. The estate, the art, the stocks, the offshore accounts, everything. It all went to them. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited. There had to be something. A trust, a property, something. Abernathy paused. And to my daughter, Clara Sterling, I leaned forward, holding my breath. I bequeath a monthly stipend of $5,000 under the condition that she does not contest this will. $5,000 a month. In our world, that's pocket money. It was a gag order with a price tag. Then came the final insult. She is also to receive the contents of my personal library, a collection of books we once shared. Silence. The air crackled with their victory. I looked at my brothers. Richard's face was a mask of cold control. But Edward, the charmer, gave me a tiny, pitying smile. It was the cruelest look I had ever seen. It said, "We won. You were never even in the game." I turned to Mr. Abernathy, looking for the kind man I grew up with. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was in on it. He'd probably drafted the whole damn thing. "That's it," I whispered. Richard stood up. "Father was very clear, Clara. He felt your artistic pursuits left you unprepared. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of." It was so perfectly crafted, this lie. They were spinning theft into an act of love. Before I could even think, Edward delivered the final blow. "Richard and I have been talking," he said softly. "This house is far too large. We'll be selling it. Of course, we'll give you a few weeks to get your things. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. It's what Father would have wanted." They weren't just disinheriting me, they were exiling me, erasing me. They left me with a pittance, a box of old books, and the ghost of a father's apology. As I walked out of that study, the weight of their perfect, seamless betrayal settled over me. I was nothing. And now I had nothing. The next few weeks were a blur of pure humiliation. My brothers gave me 2 weeks to pack my life into cardboard boxes. The staff, people who'd known me since birth, wouldn't look me in the eye. I was a ghost in my own home. The world of effortless privilege I'd known had just vanished. I found a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in a part of the city I'd only ever driven through. The $5,000 stipend, which sounded like so much in that office, evaporated after rent, security deposit, and cheap furniture. It was a perfectly calculated sum, just enough to keep me from being homeless, but never enough to give me the resources to fight back. It was a leash. My so-called friends disappeared. Calls went unanswered. I was a Sterling in name only, a tarnished brand. I got a job at a coffee shop. The irony was thick enough to choke on. I was serving lattes to people who lived in buildings my family owned. Some even recognized me, their faces a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. I'd just smile, take their order, and die a little inside. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake for hours, replaying the will reading, my brothers' smug faces. I fell into a deep, gray depression. The boxes of books from my father's library sat in a corner, mocking me. For weeks, I couldn't touch them. One night, after a particularly awful shift, I'd hit rock bottom. I was behind on rent and living on instant noodles. With a surge of anger, I tore open a box. I pulled out the books, his old, worn copies of Shakespeare, a first edition of Moby Dick, and at the bottom, his favorite, The Count of Monte Cristo. As I lifted it, it felt off. It was too heavy. The back cover felt thick. My fingers traced the edge and found a faint ridge. I grabbed a kitchen knife and carefully pried the back cover open. It was a hollow compartment, and inside, nestled in faded velvet, were two items. The first was a small, old-fashioned key. The second was a single piece of folded notepaper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was my father's handwriting, shaky and frail. The note was short and cryptic. It made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It said, "The foundation is not what it seems. Sterling is built on a lie. Forgive me." Suddenly, his last words crashed back into my mind. Forgive me. It wasn't about the will. It was about this. This was his real legacy, not money but a secret, a key and a confession. For the first time in months, the fog in my head cleared, replaced by a sharp, electrifying purpose. My brothers thought he'd left me with nothing, but he had left me a weapon. The investigation became my entire world. The key had no markings. I spent my days off going from bank to bank, getting rejected over and over. It felt hopeless, but the note burned in my pocket. The foundation is not what it seems. After 3 weeks, I found a small, private institution I'd never heard of, Metropolitan Trust and Depository. An old clerk looked at the key, and his eyes widened. "It's one of ours," he rasped, "from the old vault." He led me down to a subterranean vault, opened box number 738, and left me alone in a small viewing room. My heart was pounding. Inside the box weren't valuables but documents, old ledgers, faded contracts, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope. Inside was a multi-page, notarized confession signed by a man named Alastair Finch. I'd never heard the name. I spent the next 4 hours in that room as my world tilted on its axis. The official story was a lie. My father hadn't started his company with a family loan. He'd started it with stolen money. In the early 1970s, there was a major art heist at a gallery in Geneva. A Monet, a Degas, a Renoir, all vanished. The crime was never solved. According to this confession, Alastair Finch and my father were the thieves. They smuggled the paintings back to the States and sold a few on the black market for their seed money. That cash, laundered through shell corporations, became the foundation of Sterling Homes. But there was a twist. Finch wrote that my father betrayed him, cutting him out of the deal. Finch was later arrested on an unrelated charge and died in prison, taking the secret with him. Almost. But the most explosive detail was that they hadn't sold all the paintings. The most valuable pieces were hidden in a custom-built, climate-controlled vault disguised as a wine cellar renovation. A vault in the sub-basement of the Sterling family estate. They were sitting right under my brother's feet. My father's empire, my brother's inheritance, their perfect lives, all of it was a criminal enterprise. I couldn't do this alone. Finch's confession mentioned a daughter. A quick search led me to Amelia Finch. Her profession? Public defender, a lawyer who fought for the underdog. I found her in her cluttered office. I didn't waste time. I laid a copy of her father's confession on her desk. She read it, her face a storm of shock, grief, anger, and then dawning understanding. She'd always heard her grandfather had been cheated by a business partner. She just never knew the business was grand larceny. "Your family," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "built an empire on my family's ruin." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "And they left me with nothing, so I want to take everything. I want to dismantle the lie piece by piece." A slow, cold smile spread across Amelia's face. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting her whole life for a fight like this. "All right, Clara Sterling," she said, extending a hand. "Let's burn their world to the ground." The next 2 months were a masterclass in secret warfare. While I kept my job at the coffee shop, Amelia was quietly building our case. We weren't just planning a lawsuit, we were orchestrating a demolition. She discreetly contacted art crime units in France and Switzerland and flagged potential tax fraud with federal agencies. Meanwhile, Richard and Edward were flying high. Sterling Homes was on the verge of a multi-billion-dollar merger. The press hailed them as visionaries. They were planning a massive gala at the estate to celebrate, the perfect stage for their downfall. The day of the gala, I made my move. Amelia sent a request for a final meeting. The pretense was simple. I was willing to sign away all future claims for a pitifully small lump sum settlement. Their arrogance was their undoing. They agreed, eager to be rid of me for good. I walked through the gates of the estate for the first time in nearly a year. Caterers and staff swarmed the grounds. My brothers had me shown to the study, the same room where my life had been dismantled. They were there, oozing confidence. Mr. Abernathy was with them, papers ready. "Clara," Richard began, "glad you've come to your senses." Edward chimed in with that fake sympathy. "We just want you to be secure. Father knew you weren't cut out for this world." I let them talk. I let them lay out their narrative. I wore a mask of resignation. Mr. Abernathy slid the papers toward me. "If you'll just sign here, Clara." I looked down at the papers, then back up at them, and for the first time I let them see the steel in my eyes. "No," I said. The room fell silent. "What did you say?" Richard snapped. I said no. I pushed their papers back. "I'm not here to sign a surrender. I'm here to discuss the true foundation of Sterling Homes." I reached into my bag and pulled out a copy of Alastair Finch's confession. I slid it right on top of their settlement. "I believe this belongs to you." Richard picked it up. As he read, the color drained from his face. Edward leaned over his shoulder, his charming smile finally cracking. "What is this?" Richard stammered. "This is slander, it's nonsense." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Is it nonsense that the seed money for this company came from a stolen degas? Is it nonsense that you're about to host a party on top of a hidden vault containing a priceless, stolen Monet?" Abernathy blustered. "These are baseless accusations. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," I said. On cue, the study door opened. It wasn't a butler, it was Amelia Finch. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice ice. "I am Amelia Finch, granddaughter of Alastair Finch. I represent Miss Sterling." She opened her briefcase, revealing stacks of files. "We've been in communication with the authorities in Switzerland and France, as well as the FBI's art crime team and the IRS. The evidence is overwhelming." She laid it all out. The criminal charges, the civil charges, the tax evasion and money laundering. Their entire empire was the fruit of a poisonous tree, and it was all about to be seized. Richard stared at me, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You," he whispered, "our own sister." "You left me with nothing," I said, my voice steady. "You always underestimated me." Then I delivered the killing blow. "You should probably know," I said, glancing at the antique clock on the mantel, "that the FBI secured a search warrant for this house an hour ago. They're right on schedule." As if I'd summoned them, the deep chime of the front doorbell echoed through the mansion. It wasn't a guest. It was the sound of their world ending. We heard commotion, raised voices, the unmistakable sound of authority. Richard, Edward, and Abernathy were frozen in pure terror. Justice had arrived, and I had sent the invitation. The immediate aftermath was beautiful chaos, and I had a front row seat. From the study window, I watched as a fleet of federal cars streamed up the driveway. Agents poured out and swarmed the mansion. The party planners scattered like startled birds. The agents who entered the study were all business. The sight of Richard and Edward, these titans of industry, being read their rights in their own seat of power was surreal. Their arrogance vanished, replaced by raw fear. Edward was babbling. Richard was silent, his eyes locked on me with a hatred I'll never forget. The search was devastatingly efficient. Guided by Finch's confession, they found the hidden vault with almost comical ease. The news crews, tipped off by an anonymous source, Amelia is very thorough, arrived just in time to film agents carrying priceless, wrapped paintings out of the house, live on national television. The Monet, the Degas, the Renoir, seeing them emerge into the daylight after 50 years felt like a kind of liberation. The fallout was instant and total. The merger didn't just collapse, it detonated. The stock price of Sterling Homes plunged to zero. The headlines were brutal. "Titans of industry or family of thieves." My brothers' names, once a symbol of success, were now linked forever to crime. Their high society friends deserted them. Every asset was frozen. The cars, the jets, the penthouses, all seized. In a single afternoon, my brothers went from masters of the universe to inmates in orange jumpsuits. Their perfect world hadn't just been shaken, it had been incinerated. The fire was every bit as consuming as I had hoped. The legal battles were swift and brutal. The evidence was insurmountable. Abernathy, facing his own ruin, turned on my brothers for a lighter sentence. Richard and Edward were convicted on multiple counts and received long prison sentences, their lives reduced to a concrete cell. I didn't become fabulously wealthy. The recovered paintings were returned. The remaining assets of Sterling homes were seized to pay off decades of taxes and penalties. But justice has its own rewards. I received substantial finder's fees from several agencies and museums. It wasn't the Sterling fortune, but it was clean money. Amelia secured a significant settlement for her family, finally righting a wrong that had haunted them for 2 generations. The real victory, though, was never about the money. It was about the truth. It was about dismantling a legacy of lies. It was about vindicating the part of my father who knew what he did was wrong, the part that left me a key and a prayer for forgiveness. He didn't leave me the key to a fortune. He left me the key to his conscience, trusting that I, the artistic, unprepared daughter, was the only one who would know what to do with it. I never rebuilt Sterling Homes. That name was poison. Instead, I used my resources to start the Finch Sterling Foundation, an organization that supports emerging artists who feel overlooked. My first act was to fund a new wing for the public art gallery, making sure beautiful things could be seen by everyone, not locked away in a billionaire's basement. Sometimes I walk past the old estate. The gates are chained, the gardens are overgrown, and a for sale by federal marshal sign is stabbed into the lawn. It's just an empty house now, a hollow shell. It holds no power over me. My brothers left me with nothing, thinking it would break me. But in that nothing, I found everything that mattered, my own strength, justice, and the freedom to build a life on my own terms. They took my name, my home, and my past. I left them with the truth. And in the silence of their ruined world, I finally found my own voice. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss the next one.